our industries, and we do view the livestock sector as a stakeholder and as a partner, are really reliant upon each other, and our profitability is linked. And in many cases, just as in this picture, we may be propping each other up in one form or another. And so that is really the aspects of how we feel that our industries are linked from that standpoint. Now, Caleb had described a little bit about the industry itself, and he talked about federal policy, the renewable fuel standard specifically. One of the things that he didn't necessarily say is that we're unique, or special at least from that perspective, and special from the standpoint that whenever the statute was written, the biodiesel industry is the only industry in which actual requirements are not outlined on a calendar year basis. So, for example, each year, the EPA administrator, in consultation with the Secretaries of Agriculture as well as Energy, takes a look at market conditions, and based upon those market conditions each year, determines what that requirement should be in terms of use of biodiesel across the United States. So the burden of proof is really on our shoulders to be able to look at market conditions, and we do take that very seriously. And so on an annual basis, we commit a lot of resources to look at everything from impacts on feedstock supply all the way down to impacts on pollinators. And one of the things that we have spent a lot of time trying to look at and categorize is our impacts of an increased production and use of biodiesel on the livestock sector. I've had the chance over the past year or so to be able to reach out and speak with quite a few groups, livestock groups, as well as commodity associations on the state level. One of the things which I have found to be pretty interesting is that there actually is a little bit of a lack of awareness about how important animal fats in the livestock sector are to the biodiesel industry. So when you think about historical uses of animal fats specifically, primarily they've been used in feed or exported to other countries. And interesting enough, when you talk to some of the traders, we find that the export market for animal fats has actually declined pretty significantly over the last few years. You know, the traders attribute that to multiple things. Some of it's sustainability requirements. So some of these animal fats which are being exported, for example, to Europe now have to be mapped and tracked, so they have to be able to go all the way back to be able to understand where those sources come from. And to some degree, if there's a domestic market that actually has more value, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of being able to utilize those same commodities here in the United States. The other thing which is interesting, and Caleb had mentioned it, you didn't get to see it on the slide because it didn't transfer, but he indicated that somewhere between 10 to 15% of animal fats compose the biodiesel industry in the United States. But what it doesn't tell is the fact that when you look at animal fats produced in the United States as a whole, use for biodiesel actually represents about 25% of all of the domestically produced animal fats. So we are a significant portion of the animal fats which are produced here in the United States. And just as one example to show you the significance, and of course I cherry-picked and looked at choice white grease, but in the choice white grease industry, more than 40% last year was used to produce biodiesel here in the United States. So it's significant. Obviously, the livestock sector, animal fats are important to us. The question is can we quantify that and actually put a dollar value to it? Now, for me to be able to come here and speak today, I'm an economist, by the way, by training, I had to promise Caleb that I would not get too far down in the weeds from an economics perspective. Or as Caleb said, don't be boring. So I'm just going to introduce a couple of concepts and then try to summarize a handful of studies and analyses which we have done, which I think really paint the picture of how our two industries are joined at the hip. Not to get back into the weeds, I promise not to, but I do think it's important that we think about some simple economic principles. And we do have to think about price and the differences between the meat markets and the animal fat markets. Okay, so help me out here as we go. If all of a sudden we have a lot more demand for pork loins or for chicken or for smoked brisket and ribeyes, and we have a tremendous surge in demand, what happens to price? You can help me out. Goes up. Okay. So then over the long term, or at least in the midterm, that price signal goes back to the herds or to the flocks, and we would probably see an expansion of those herds. And then we get further down, and because of the expansion of supply, we actually see a mitigation of that price increase. So prices come back down. It's a cycle we've all seen as producers, right? Whether we're on the row crop side or whether we're on the livestock side. The animal fat markets work just a little bit different. Okay? So in this particular case, if we have an increase in demand, such as biodiesel. That increase in demand is actually going to increase prices a little bit, but because animal fats, as a component of drop value, represent a much smaller portion of the overall carcass value, we don't necessarily see that corresponding increase in supply in terms of a signal. So we get a price increase, we don't get that same signal back to increase supply. And so the end result is we actually keep those prices up and we continue to hold that value. We wanted to actually try to pinpoint this. We started off just looking at correlation. So do prices move together? And we looked at the soybean oil markets and we looked at the animal fats. They do move together. And post-2007, whenever the biodiesel industry took off, we actually saw that correlation increase, which basically meant they moved even closer together after biodiesel production increased. We wanted to go a step further, though, and say, but what portion of the increase in animal fat value was specifically because of biodiesel? So there, economically, we looked at regression, performed a regression analysis. We looked at export markets, the biodiesel contribution. We looked at competing products for energy in the ration, so palm stearine, corn. And when it all factors out, on the inedible tallow side, from this time period, which was January of 2009 to last summer, this analysis was done in the fall of last year, we attributed a little over 10 cents per pound in terms of inedible tallow to biodiesel production, a little over 10 cents a pound to choice white grease, and a little bit under 6 cents a pound in terms of poultry fat. So that was the increase on a cents per pound basis of those particular animal fats specifically due to biodiesel production. So in the room here today, do we have livestock producers that are on the ground with herds, or we got a handful? You count too, Jackie, so there we go. So we have a handful. Groups in here that support livestock producers in terms of either working for commodity associations or otherwise. Okay, so we got quite a handful at that point in time. So this was our attempt to be able to take that back and look at what it means on an individual animal basis. So I should actually add one more thing, which is we've just recently, this will be released this month, Inform Economics has helped us out. One of the things that they wanted to look at was not just the actual impact on prices, but the historic relationship between vegetable oils and animal fats. So historically, soybean oil was here, was at a premium, animal fats were here, always at a discount. One of the interesting aspects is that after an increase in production in biodiesel, that discount weakened. So we've actually brought up on a proportional basis some of the animal fat prices. And so when we take a look at that, at what it means on an individual animal basis, when you look at the amount of tallow, inedible tallow, choice white grease, lard, and poultry fat, we can see that over the same time period that we talked about, a little more than $16 a head in terms of added value for a steer or heifer moving through the sale barn, about $1.25 in terms of a fat hog moving to market. And poultry, not as much necessarily. We're talking only a penny per bird, but there are a lot of birds and still more than $50 million worth of added value to the industry back in 2013. So that's a little bit on the revenue side of the equation. Caleb also introduced, though, the fact that not just on the revenue side, but we have the cost side of the equation as well. In the fact that soybeans, which are the predominant feedstock, as Caleb had indicated, about 50% of the biodiesel production is produced from soybean oil. That soybeans, though, in the United States are not necessarily produced for oil, as he said. We produce for protein. So we crush for protein, soybean oil being the co-product. But if, however, we think about that relationship back and forth of these co-products, they're linked as well. So anytime that we would have an increase in demand for one of the co-products, in this case the oil, specifically because of a new demand like biodiesel, if that leads to any increased production or it leads to additional crush because it helps to improve crush margins, in the end what we result in is an additional supply of meal, which does lower the relative value or the relative price of meal, having an impact on rations. Again, this is work that will be released this month from Inform Economics. They took a look over a 7-year time period going back to 2007, looked at each of the individual years in terms of the amount of soybean oil utilized and then the impact that it had on meal values. So what you see on the bars is just the actual range in terms of impact, ranging from somewhere between $21 to $42 over the entire time period. And the actual shaded portion is just a cumulative impact, which is about $6 billion of a decreased protein costs over that same time period. Again, trying to pull this back to a per animal basis, I found that talking with my father, he runs the commercial cow-calf operation. Well, they're his cows, except when the fence needs to be fixed, then they're my cows too. But normally they're just his, and he always wants to talk about, well, what's this mean to me? And so when we started looking at the amount of soybean meal in a typical ration, and we looked at these impacts, it was about $2.50 on a sow on an annual basis. Feeder to farrow, or feeder to finish operation, a little bit more. On the beef side of the equation, from a dairy standpoint on an annual basis, about $5.50 per head, and close to $4 on a feedlot operation. So you don't notice poultry in there. We're just finishing up the poultry analysis. On a turkey basis, this is probably going to be in the 35 to 45 cent range. And on a broiler basis, we're probably talking about a nickel. So you put the two together on broilers, around 6 cents between the revenue side as well as the cost side of the equation. So covered revenues, covered costs. The last thing that I wanted to talk about before we open it up into questions relates to, again, a co-product linkage. Every time that we produce 100 pounds of biodiesel, we also produce about 10 pounds of glycerin. You may or may not be familiar with glycerin, but chances are if there was an ingredient list in your hotel room on the soaps or shampoos, you would probably see glycerin as a component. We also use glycerin in propylene glycol. Your coal trains moving across the United States, a lot of times if they're in cold temperatures, they'll use glycerin to make sure that it doesn't freeze. Glycerin is used as an asphalt release agent. The list just goes on. Several of those are higher value uses for glycerin. However, glycerin is an energy source as well and can be used in feed rations. And it is used quite regularly in ruminant rations in Texas. And working with groups such as the American Feed Ingredients Association, who took the lead, we've helped to ensure that it is listed in the official publication of AFCO. And so therefore, whenever we see energy prices, as in ration energy prices going up, so if you have high corn prices, glycerin can break into the ration. So it's another way to be able to mitigate risk. So realistically, when at least I think about profitability, you think about the simple things, you think about revenues, you think about costs, you think about mitigating risk. Increased biodiesel use and production does help to add value to that carcass. So we know that we've added some dollars back into that value chain on the livestock side. On the cost basis, we know that increased oil demand can help lead to increased supplies of meal, so help keep those costs in check from a protein standpoint. And in certain times, in certain cycles, glycerin, of course, could also be used as an energy source. We're working to help try to quantify this on a state or a regional basis. This is just one example of what it meant in 2014 to the Nebraska livestock industry when you start looking at increased revenues and protein costs for beef, swine, and dairy. I'm glad to be here, and when we can open it up for questions for Caleb. I realistically wanted to be here for just a couple of reasons. I wanted to make sure that you as our partners understood how serious we take this in terms of our relationship with the livestock sector, the amount of effort that we've gone to ensure that if we get the number right in terms of growth, they can be beneficial for both of our industries. And the second thing is that soybean farmers and the soybean industry are very important stakeholders for our industry. The livestock sector is obviously very important to the soybean industry, you being their number one customer on the meal side. So what's important to soybeans are typically pretty important to us as well.